Welcome to the castle, everybody. This is Nightsaber Z42, and today we're going to be taking a look at Alien the Role-Playing Game, Destroyer of Worlds, published by Free League Publishing and written by Andrew E.C. Gasca. So, real quick, this is the second cinematic scenario that Free League Publishing has released out of the trilogy. I believe we'll be getting the last one sometime in 2022. Don't quote me on that, but let's take a look and see what's actually inside the box. First thing that you're going to get are the maps for each of the separate locations that are actually in this scenario. I don't actually have them here because of my awesome galaxy map from the starter set, but there are about the same size as the galaxy map for the actual city and Fort Nebraska, and then you have some smaller ones that have about 2 maps per side for the smaller locations like the medical center and stuff like that. You also get access to cards like the actual NPCs that you can meet. You have cards for vehicles and equipment. You have the personal agenda cards. Remember, each actual PC gets 3, 1 for each act. And then you have some story cards for things that can happen to your PCs. And there are certain specific ones that you would actually give to a PC that's not part of their personal agenda. So very interesting that we actually have separate story cards this time around. Of course, we have the character sheets themselves, and we'll go over the characters here in a little bit. But as of note, there are actually 7 characters to choose from this time around, so you're not relegated to choosing 5. And there's extras in case one of your PCs actually dies. So remember, this is actually part of the Colonial Marines supplement that came out before this product. So it's really cool that all of your PCs are actually part of a fire team, which is really cool. I actually really do like that. Last but not least is the actual book, Destroyer of Worlds, which has everything that you need to play. And remember, kind of going off the same line as my thoughts from the core rulebook and the starter set, you actually only need one of those, either the starter set or the actual core rulebook and Colonial Marines book, because everything in this book is actually in one of the appendices, which we'll talk about later. For now, let's talk about the characters. So players get to choose between one of 5 characters. From Dante, Private First Class. He's the Marine Breacher. He's the Assault Marine Breacher. You have Hammer, who's a private. He's the Automatic Rifleman, Smart Gun Operator. You have Mason, the Gunnery Sergeant, Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Defense Specialist. He's also a squad leader. You have Chaplain, the Ward Officer, Combat Technician, Hospital Corpsman. He is the android of the scenario. We'll come back to him in just a little bit. You have Silva, the captain, field commander, Charlie team. You have Iona, sergeant, automatic rifleman, and Mizuki, sorry, I don't even know how to begin to pronounce that, private first class rifleman. So players get access to those. Thing about the whole scenario as a whole, one of the characters has already been infected with a chest burster, and it's only a matter of time. And we'll talk about that when we actually get into the Destroyer of Worlds actual adventure. Chaplain is your android, and as the android, they're privy to certain things. And this one is actually no exception. And what makes this one unique is that Chaplain is actually not under control of itself. It's actually under the control of another AI, which might stay that way or it might change over the course of the adventure. Of course, you have a whole plethora of NPCs, mostly the bad guys from the scenario who just want to use your PCs to get what they want. And you have different factions to work around with, like the UPP. They are actually a force that becomes known in Act 2. Of course, you have some of your other uh, actual Marines, like your leader and stuff like that, the person who gave you the actual mission, and then you have the AWOL Marines. So let's actually talk about the adventure. In Destroyer of Worlds, the PCs are tasked with finding 4 AWOL Marines. They aren't told anything other than that, only that they are at risk of defecting to the UPP. Simple enough. They have to go to a moon, the Arcturus moon, and find these 4 AWOL PCs, or AWOL Marines. It's not as easy as that, because these 4 Marines have already been infected with some sort of xenomorph creature. They were also experimented on to receive a vaccine for that, but of course things never go right. So the first thing that you get in the book is a overview of the actual adventure. So you get Acts 1, Act 2, and Act 3 just kind of detailed out for you right there. You get some information about the Kruger 60 system, which is where Ariarchus is. Sorry, I totally biffed on that name earlier. And you get another blurb about the most notable locations like Fort Nebraska, where your players will actually eventually go in the third act. You get a whole situation about what's really going on, why are the Marines AWOL, and who they are, and then you have your introduction blurb that you tell your players, which to me feels a little bit too lengthy, but it does set up the whole flavor and really what you're doing here. You also get information on the NPCs, each of the 4 AWOL Marines, like what's happened to them, other NPCs that you might meet along the way. You have some minor NPCs which are statted, very nice. And then you have the locations that you're going to go to on your stay on Ariarchus, like the colony. By the way, I absolutely love this map. This is the big map that you actually get in the product itself, and I just love the attention to detail here. You could definitely pull that into another sci-fi type game. And so each of the locations actually has their own map, both here and physically, and it also gives you the rundown of what's inside each of the rooms there, and any enemies that are happen to be waiting there. All of the NPCs, by the way, or rather xenomorphs and stuff like that, are in the back of the book in the appendices, which is fantastic because if you don't have the core rulebook or the anything like that or the starter set, then this will actually kind of serve that purpose. So you get information on each of the locations, and actually what's really interesting is for most of the locations you have an Act 1 variant and an Act 2 variant. Sometimes I think even Act 3 variant, because Act 1 is basically where everything is fine and dandy, everything is normal. Act 2, things really start to hit the fan, and by Act 3, it goes all out of control. So actually, let's talk about the different acts. Act 1 begins with the players getting on Ariarchus and looking for the AWOL Marines. Now, by this point, the 4 Marines have already gone their separate ways, making their task even more difficult. So they can go around Ariarchus to the different locations to get some information as to where they might have gone, who saw them where, and follow up on those leads. So you have events that can take place on that search. Some of them are mandatory, and of course, these are just like some help to point the PCs in the right direction. You can actually introduce those AWOL Marines in any order, but once you meet a certain one, the one who actually decides to turn into a neomorph or bloodburster, that's where we get into Act 2. So once you actually deal with that problem, Act 2 begins. So for Act 2, the UPP actually makes an appearance and starts to bombard the moon and Fort Nebraska. So the PCs now have a task to actually go back to Fort Nebraska and get out of there. The only thing is, the UPP is definitely leaving the space elevator alone. It's like an elevator that sends them to the planet or something like that, or out into space or something like that, from my understanding. I don't know exactly where it goes. I just know that it starts in Fort Nebraska and goes somewhere else. So the PCs are tasked with going back to Fort Nebraska. Of course, as they travel throughout the city, things happen. You have all sorts of events that can happen, like the tank suddenly shows up. You might see an execution. Are you going to stop them? And stuff like that. There are some reoccurring NPCs that you could also meet along the way during Act 2, but of course, none of those are mandatory. Act 3 begins anytime the GM decides that it's been long enough. Something major and catastrophic happens. There is a black goo bombardment. Now, it's never told who does it, whether it's an engineer or some other faction. All that is left for the GM to know and therefore the players to know is that it happens. At about 4 kilometers away, the Black Death just rains down on civilians and military people alike, both UPP and the USCMC. So that happens. So Act 3 begins with players kind of going through the rest of the city to get to Fort Nebraska while abominations are just swarming the area. Everybody, if they weren't at the impact of the black goo, then they become an abomination. The PCs are spared that gruesome death by not being in the impact radius, and one of my major critiques with this is that it's never really given where the black goo just happens. It just says that it has to happen in the periphery, which is 4 kilometers away. That way they aren't really infected. So Act 3 begins with players going back to Fort Nebraska, realizing that everything is destroyed, but the elevator is still functional if they can actually get the power up and running. So Act 3 is basically a dungeon crawl, a sci-fi dungeon crawl to actually get out of there. But it's not as easy as that, because once they actually get to the elevator and get it running, they realize that a xenomorph queen has made her base at the bottom of the elevator. So now they have to deal with that. If that wasn't enough, some of the ships actually run into the elevator, or at least the shaft, thereby destroying that portion of the elevator. So now the elevator is going up, but there's unfinished track. So the PCs have to make it off of the elevator somehow. And there's basically a suggested way to do that. And that's the good ending. Of course, they're probably not going to get that far because a lot of things can happen along the way. At the end, you have the appendices, which gives you the anathema, which is the disease that happens from the black goo, the different stages, the xenomorphs that you'll encounter, the xenomorph queen that you'll encounter. So really anything that you need to run this adventure is actually here in this booklet. And that's really good because that means I only really need one book, and that's this one. I don't really need the core rulebook or the rulebook from the starter set. Everything's here. I actually really do enjoy this product as a whole. I absolutely love the fact that you get maps, you get cards, you get actual character sheets. Like, if Dungeons and Dragons actually followed this model instead of like those big hardbound books with lots of useless information, then I would be doing a lot more of those adventures. This one, it's very simple to run. It's in 3 acts, is per the usual, the norm, but everything that you need is contained in this 88-page booklet that includes NPCs, monsters, creatures, and stuff like that. So in terms of the overall story, I actually found it to be very interesting. I do like the fact that, the PCs are tasked with finding for AWOL Marines at first, and there are different locations for each of the Marines. Like one is in a hospital. One of the Marines is actually cured but doesn't know that. That's a really interesting twist. And the final Marine that you do find, or not, it could be one of the first ones, turns into a bloodburster, releasing the alien baby inside, and the Marines actually have to deal with that before Act 2. So I did find a lot of the locations to be very interesting. I do like the fact that there are maps to go along with that. I think the adventure falls apart in Act 2, and that could have been because of my misunderstanding about what actually does happen in Act 2. So my assumption was that in Act 2, the players are in the actual complex where they meet the Bloodburster, and they have to travel to the city. So there really wouldn't be anything between that point and the city before Act 3 happens. But that's actually not true. The players are actually going into the city to do those encounters to get back to Fort Nebraska. And the thing that I probably should have paid attention to a lot more or a lot sooner was the map of Fort Nebraska and just how big it actually really is. Like Fort Nebraska is many kilometers long. There's a nice chart right here about my thumb's width is about 1 kilometer, so it's quite big. And I didn't really process that in the first place, so that's probably where my criticisms for Act 2 really lie, was my misunderstanding of that. And so when Act 3 actually happens, there's a 4 kilometer radius of where that actually the impact happens, so your players might be just out of the edge of that. It's not going to consume the entire city, but it will start there, and as the abominations start attacking other people, the infection spreads. So all hell is let loose by that point. I really did dig Act 3 though. I like the whole dungeon crawling scenario that they have there, and how you make it to the elevator, but it's not all, just like in Alien and Aliens and basically every Alien movie. It's not the end just because you get to the save point, because it's not really safe. There's a alien queen, a xenomorph queen, right there laying her eggs, and so the players have to deal with that. And then to the cherry on top is the elevator gets destroyed partway through, and now they have to actually escape the elevator somehow to actually survive. So that's pretty much it for this entire adventure, and I'm really looking forward to the third one that's going to get released. I haven't really read anything up on that because I like to be spoiler free until I actually get to it, but this is definitely well worth it if you like cinematic scenarios, or if you're looking for, just a quick thing that you can run for your players. I mean, it isn't 3 acts, but if you really pick your events, you could definitely rush through it in a night, a long night, by the way. So feel free to leave a comment down below, give this video a huge thumbs up to support this series, and subscribe if you would like to see more. I will see you guys in the next video.